אנחנו רוצים להתחיל, יש עוד אנשים כולכם ישובים, ישובות. אנחנו עוברים לחלק השני של היום, תכף נתחיל את ההרצאות. אנחנו נעשה עכשיו בעצם הצגה של 5 מקרי מבחן, ואז נתקדם לשולחנות העגולים. שרון, בואי תציגי בבקשה.
Okay, so I will continue in English because we have some guests from abroad who unfortunately couldn't join us from abroad, but they will be online. The first speaker is an Israeli speaker, Professor Tal Alon Moses. She's a professor and esteemed scholar of landscape architecture at the Technion in Israel. She specializes in the intersections of landscape architecture and cultural identity, particularly in the Israeli context. Her research often explores the historical and socio-cultural influences on Israeli landscape and how they shape the nation's ecological practices. We will hear from you a little bit about the theories of sustainable and urban planning that you're dealing with. Please.
אחר הצהריים טובים לכולם, ותודה לכל מי שחזר לכאן מהסיור בגנים. כפי שנאמר, שמי טלי אלון מוזס, ואני רוצה להציג לכם עבודה שעוסקת בשימור מרחבים היסטוריים שיעל סופר, דוקטור יעל סופר שנמצאת כאן ואנוכי ערכנו בשביל מחלקת השימור של עיריית תל אביב. לאחר שהעירייה סקרה בפירוט את גינות גדס, היא התפנתה לחקור את המרחבים האורבניים שנוצרו בשנות ה-50 עד שנות ה-70, ואנחנו חקרנו כ-30 מרחבים שכאלה, במטרה לקדם את השימור של לפחות חלק מהם, ואם לא את כל המרכיבים של הגינות, ועסקנו לא רק בגינות אלא גם במרקמים אורבניים כמו ברמת אביב ובשכונת יד אליהו. הרי שחלק מהמרחבים האלה, לפי אותם עקרונות שדיברו עליהם במושב הראשון של ה-Historic Urban Landscape. ואני רוצה להציג היום את הדוגמה של גן העצמאות בתל אביב, שאני חושבת שהיא דוגמה לגן שעדיין שומר על הרוח של שנות ה-50 שבהם הוא נוצר. והגן הזה נפתח שנת 52, כמו שאתם רואים בפרסום של העירייה, פאר גניה של תל אביב-יפו. הוא אחד משורה של גנים שנוצרו או תוכננו ובוצעו מיד לאחר הקמת המדינה, והם נוצרו באיזשהו קונטקסט היסטורי, באיזשהו רגע היסטורי מאוד מכונן, שגנים נחשבו כחלק מערך של מדינה מודרנית ומתקדמת. המודל היה מודל של ערים אירופאיות, שלכל פארק יש את הגן משלו, לכל עיר יש את הפארק המרכזי משלה, ותרבות הגן הייתה חלק מיצירה של תרבות עברית או ישראלית כאן בארץ ישראל.
Recording in progress.
מה זה? כאשר מצד שמאל אתם יכולים לראות עוד איזושהי כרזה הרבה יותר מוקדמת מ-1935, חתומה על ידי ראש העיר דיזינגוף, אבל כנראה מי שכתב אותה היה ביאליק, שהוא מעודד את התושבים לטעת גנים. ולאחר המלחמה התפנו שטחים שהערבים גורשו, עזבו, ונוצר שטח פתוח, אם זה באזור של סלמה ג' שהפך להיות גן התקווה, ואם זה כאן, היכן שבית הקברות נמצא אומנם מדרום, אבל היה אזור מחנה צבאי מצפון, האזור הזה התפנה. בן גוריון מקבל פנייה ומכריז על מבצע, אפשר להגיד, לאומי של הפיכת כל השטחים הנטושים האלה לגנים, והשמות שלהם מבטאים באמת את אותה רוח של נחישות ושל גבורה, כמו עכשיו מדברים על זה, גן העצמאות, גן התקווה וגנים נוספים המסורת הזאת. ותל אביב הייתה אחת החלוצות בנטיעה של הגנים. הקצב של נטיעת הגנים היה די גדול והלך וגבר עם הקמת המדינה. אפשר לראות כאן נתונים מ-48 ונתונים מ-59, עשור מאוחר יותר, ורק תסתכלו על מספר העצים שכמעט הכפיל את עצמו פי 8, כאשר אנחנו רואים בכל העיר, וזה לא רק עצים ברחובות, זה עצים גם בפארקים, באיי תנועה, בכיכרות, במוסדות חינוך. אפשר לראות כאן גם את המפה הזאת מידיעון עיריית תל אביב, שמראה את התפרוסת של הגנים ואת השנים שבהם הוקמו. כאשר אחד הגנים הראשונים, שהוא היה, אפשר להגיד, המודל לגן העברי הראשון בעיר העברית הראשונה, זהו גן מאיר, שיש לו סיפור מאוד מאוד מעניין. רק בזכות הבריטים התוכנית המקורית זכתה למימוש. הצעות מתחרות שהיו ב-1932 הבשילו לבסוף עשור מאוחר יותר בתמיכה של המנדט הבריטי, וכאן אנחנו רואים את טקס פתיחה של הגן והמלאכים שככה צובעים על השדרה המרכזית שבו. ומכאן אני רוצה לעבור לפעולה של אברהם קרוון, שהיה דמות מפתח בכל יצירת אותם גנים. הוא היה אחד מהאנשים המובילים בעיריית תל אביב כראש מחלקת הנטיעות העירונית. אם הזכרנו קודם את גן מאיר, הוא דאג לכך שגן מאיר יתממש, הביא צמחים ממסעותיו בארץ ושתל אותם בגן ובבריכת הנוי שהייתה בגן. היה לו תפיסה מאוד מאוד ברורה איך צריך להיות גן בארץ ישראל. תפיסה שמצד אחד אימצה את החזון הפסטורלי של הגן האנגלי כאיזשהו דימוי של טבע אידיאלי, ויחד עם זה הוא תמך בשילוב של מינים מקומיים בתוך הגנים שהוא יצר. במשך השנים הארוכות שהוא עבד בתל אביב הוא נטע הרבה מאוד גנים, הרבה מאוד מרחבים. הוא שיקם את האזור שאחר כך הפך להיות גן הפסגה ביפו, גן יעקב, גן בית יד לבנים, גן מאוד מעניין גם כן מבחינה שימורית, הוא גן שושני בצפון העיר, ועוד הרבה מאוד שאתם רואים אותו כאן בתמונה, ועוד הרבה מאוד גנים נוספים. וחלק מהאלמנטים שהוא יצר באותם גנים מלווים אותנו עד היום, ואני חושבת שאם אנחנו מדברים על אלמנטים אייקוניים שהם מייצגים תקופה, מייצגים חברה ואיזשהו חזון, אז למשל במת התזמורת שאתם רואים כאן בגן שושני, אנחנו נפגוש אותה מאוחר יותר גם בגן העצמאות בתל אביב. וכאן מה שאנחנו רואים זה את תוכנית של הגן כפי שהיא מופיעה בברושור שהוציאה העירייה, ואת התמונות מהחנוכה של הגן ב-1952, אם זו במת התזמורת שציינתי כבר, אם זה הכניסה הפורמלית המרכזית בצפון של הגן, ואם זה המרחב הגדול, הדשא הפתוח שהיה מקום להתכנסויות, לאירועים. ומה שמעניין להסתכל ולראות הוא שהגן היה מאוד מאוד ירוק, והיו הרבה מאוד אזורים של שיחים, ואם אנחנו נסתכל על הגן כיום נראה שהמסה הירוקה הזאת היא לפחות בחלקה נעלמה, וזו שאלה מאוד מעניינת על נושא של שימור, מה אנחנו משמרים, והאם את השכבה הגננית הזאת שהייתה כל כך דומיננטית בתקופה של קרוון ובתקופה של גם הלל עומר שהיה אדריכל הגנים של העיר מאוחר יותר, האם אנחנו יכולים באיזשהו אופן גם להחזיר אותה היום לגנים של המאה ה-21. אז יש כאן כמה תמונות שמייצגות את הגן. קראתי לסגנון הזה של פסטורליות ים תיכונית, שילוב של אלמנטים מקומיים, אפשר לראות את עצי האשל, השימוש המאוד מאוד אינטנסיבי בחומר הכורכר שעליו בנוי הגן, ולצידו מרחבים מאוד מאוד גדולים של דשא, וגם אפשר לראות כאן ערוגות של פרחים שגם הם נעלמו מהשפה היומיומית של גנים, פרט אני חושבת בעיקר פסי בדרכים, פסי נטייה של מפרדות. ואם דיברנו על הכורכר, גרם המדרגות המונומנטלי, שאני מניחה עדה שאת תדברי עליו אחר כך, הוא בהחלט אחד מהנופים האיקונים של גן העצמאות. כאן אנחנו רואים את החבורה של ראש העיר והמלווים אותו כאן יורדים במורד המדרגות עם הצמחייה היבשנית של הקקטוסים, והגרם מדרגות מצד ימין לו שעולה למה שהיה כאן מלון בסדרה של דקלים שלא שרדה, והטיילת שהייתה טיילת נופית על קצה המצוק, שתשימו לב למעקה שמופיע כאן, שכמובן לא עמד בשום דרישות של תקן, מעקה מאוד מאוד רומנטי שעשוי מגזרי עץ והוחלף מאוחר יותר, וריצוף שהיה כמו הרבה מאוד גנים באותה תקיפה מבוסס על כורכר כבוש. במשך השנים הגן הלך ואיבד מזוהרו, השיחים הלכו והתפשטו, יצרו מרחבים חבויים, זה היה אזור של זנות ושהרחיק הרבה מאוד מתושבי הבורגנים של העיר. אתם יכולים לראות כאן איזה דיווח מ-79 של כתבת בידיעות אחרונות, ולקראת שנת המאה לעיריית תל אביב הוחלט בשיקום הגן, ואנחנו רואים כאן את טקס החנוכה ב-2009. הפרק הזה שמסרב לעבור, I can't, לא, אני הגעתי לסוף כבר. אתם הופ. אפשר להעביר את המצגת למוד של תודה. מה שמעניין זה שמי שהציע את השימור של הגן או את הפרוגרמה לשימור הגן זה מחלקת שפע, שיפור פני העיר של העירייה, והדגשתי בבולד שהעירייה בעצמה ביקשה לשמרה מרבית של האופי ורוח התכנון המקורי, וזה רוחו של אברהם קרוון, כאשר העירייה ביקשה בעיקר טיפול בשבילי הכורכר, חידוש מערכות כמו תאורה והשקיה, ודגש מיוחד על רחבת הכניסה הצפונית, ושילוב של פרוגרמות חדשות של משחק, ומאוחר יותר גם התייחסות לשיקולים של קיימות, של טבע עירוני, שכיום חלק מהגן. מי שהופקד על השיקום של הגן והשדרוג שלו היה אדריכל נוף צבי דקל, אשר נפטר לפני שבועות ספורים. הוא היה מודרניסט בהשקפה שלו, עבד עם בורלה מרקס בברזיל ולמד איתו, וכאן אנחנו רואים את התוכנית השיקום שהוא הציע. אתם רואים את המרחבים הגדולים של הדשא, את השיחים בשוליים, את השיקום של רחבת הכניסה מצד הצפוני, ומצד שמאל אפשר לראות את רחבת המשחק שבסגול. אם אני ככה אקצר ואני אדגיש כמה מהמרחבים האלה שעברו שיקום, אחד מהם הוא רחבת הכניסה מצפון, והיא שמרה פחות או יותר על המבנה שלה. אפשר לראות את התוכנית המקורית, את התוכנית של צבי דקל. חלק מהאלמנטים לא נשמרו בגלל שיני הזמן, אפשר לומר, כמו למשל סדרת הדקלים, ובגלל שבשנים הראשונות לא כל כך הבינו את ההשפעה של הרסס ושל המליחות, ובכלל גם אחרי הקמת הגן קצת שינו את הטופוגרפיה שלו ויצרו איזושהי הגנה על החלק המרכזי. הצמחייה של הגן נשמרה בחלקים רבים ממנו, אבל במשך השנים הלכה והידלדלה, והשילוב הזה של צמחייה מקומית מצד אחד וצמחייה ואזורים שהם של מדשאות פסטורליות מאפיין את הגן עד היום. פרטים עדה תפרט, אבל כאן אפשר לראות כמה דוגמאות מאוד יפות שנשמרו מימי התכנון הראשונים של שנות ה-50, של שימוש של קורקר בקופינג, במדרגות, ברחבות, ברצפות, וניסיון מאוחר לקחת את החומר הזה של הקורקר ולהפוך אותו לחומר יותר עמיד על ידי מה שנקרא בטון קורקרי, שכיום משמש חלק מהטיילת שבעבר היה קורקר כבוש. וכבר הזכרתי את העניין הזה של המעקות שהפכו להיות מעקות תקניים כפי שצריך. ואלמנט כמעט אחרון זה הבריכה הפסיפס של האומן שמעון צבר, ששוחזרה על ידי האומנית טלי שרמן על ידי שחזור מאוד מאוד מדוקדק של האיורים שהיו בבריכה המקורית, מילוי שלה במים, אבל הבריכה הזאת היא גם עברה איזה טלטולים אפילו לאחר השימור הזה. ולסיכום, אני חושבת שאפשר להגדיר את הגן הזה טוב, אני אגיד בכמה מילים, כאיזשהו שימור שהוא שימור שהייתי קוראת לו שימור יצירתי, שמצד אחד הוא מנסה לשמר את הערכים, אם זה המוחשיים ואם זה הלא מוחשיים, כמו השימושים בגן, הסיפורים שמאחוריו, ומצד שני שימור שמנסה להביא את ההיסטוריה לתקנים של המאה ה-21, של דרישות של בטיחות ושל נגישות, של תצפית טובה יותר מהצד של הרחוב, של התאורה ושל הדגשה של נושאים של טבע עירוני מצד אחד, ומצד שני גם פעילות של צעירים, מבוגרים, פעילות ספורט שמשתלבת בתוך חורשות שקיימות. תודה.
I'm pleased to welcome Robin Winograd. She is going to be online. She is a landscape architect and an urban designer. She works in Zurich, Switzerland. Practices internationally on project, juries, lectures, teaches and publishes. She's taught design in Harvard, GSD, and her interdisciplinary background reflected in an array prize-winning projects, which ranges from the built environment to installation and garden concepts. We have had Robin here talking to us before, and I'm so happy to see you again, Robin, and I hope that throughout the year we will have more chances to work together with you, because I know you are very much into policy making as well, and we really want to welcome that. So thank you, Robin, for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I wish I could be there live, and just wanted to send out my sentiments to all of you for the situation, and I'm very happy that you can continue with this work. Great. Okay. Once again, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be involved with you guys. And I would like to begin with, let me see, just with 2 or 3 slides from a lecture I often give, and it's a bit related to what we're talking about today, and I will only show one project afterwards. But I call my work in general In Search of Geographical Reenchantment because there is a process which you can see in this graphic, which is a constant standardization and banalization of our built environment, both the natural, the cultural, and the urban landscapes. And they're becoming more and more generic and losing their identity. And this relates strongly to the work you're doing with the Garden City, with Tel Aviv, with Jaffa, how to keep the identity of our cities when, especially when they're controlled by private investors and not necessarily by urban lawmaking. So I tried to work very hard to counter against this process. And I think that cities have a lot to tell us. Every site we work in has a lot to tell us. And that's becoming increasingly difficult. Usually I give about a 10-minute introduction to all these thoughts with many quotes and many references and many pictures. And I won't do that today because we have very limited time. But I would just like to show these 2 slides to introduce what I'm about to talk about. And that is a quote that I ran into when I was a student many years ago. The purpose of architecture is to move us, by Le Corbusier. And I thought if this is true of architecture, it would be true of the city as well and the landscape as well. But we have a much more difficult job than architecture, because architecture, you control the 4 walls, the ceiling, the light, the spatial sequence, and in landscape you don't. So I've spent many years trying to study how cities have the ability to go under our skin. And one of that is by being site-specific, of course. And these are just in my own words what I mean with this title. In Search of Geographical Reenchantment is not about nostalgia, prettiness, or being emotional. It's the search using projects as concrete testing grounds to suss out the poetic potential of a site with the ability to fascinate, engage, defy expectations. It aspires to create memorable and specific places which serve as catalysts of our imagination.
Robin, I'm sorry, I think the slide has not gone through. So we're still on slide number 1.
Oh, I've had this before. I don't know. Sorry, that's why we had to test it this morning.
Oh, okay. So can you go to the green button down on your Zoom where it says share?
I have to first stop sharing and share. So now I stopped sharing. Is that correct? 1 second. Let me double check.
Yeah, and maybe you can share again. Yes.
Yes, I'll try.
No? No, it's fine?
And are you still moving
Yes,
ahead?
now it works. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I'm so happy. Okay, so that was what I just read. And I will now jump into the one project I chose to show. I would love to give other lectures about other topics, but this particular project is about heritage in the city and how we can keep heritage alive within the city. It was a 2-phase international competition invited, and this is in Germany, Heidelberg, Germany, a former Nazi military base, then became US military base, and then NATO headquarters for Europe. And the competition was to take all these fragments of the existing open space and turn them into contemporary park for the new dense neighborhood that's being built around it. And I know that's a topic that's very relevant where you are. And from the 27 invited teams, also we were all given a small brochure with photos of the relics that were left behind from the Historic Preservation Department. And for some, I don't want to say for some reason, but the other teams did not, the other teams did not take that topic of history to work with. And I, being American, and there was American-based, being Jewish, although I have no relation to the Holocaust, and having lived in southern Germany, felt very spoken to by keeping the history of this very powerful and traumatic site and using it in the contemporary park. And I began a search to find a language, a design language to do this, not in a way that was teacherly or with posters, with dates, or making people feel bad about history and so on, but with a kind of almost a humor, but also an accessibility so that people became curious and reflected about the history of this traumatic site, which is now in a completely normal housing area. So I will show here just a few slides of the site as I found it before the competition. This is the main entrance plaza. You see here giant oversized Nazi soldiers, their big Nazi eagles, and this plaza, which is just behind us, Campbell Barracks is the American name that it took over. It's very beautiful architecture, I have to say, from the Nazi era. This is the backside of the building with the parade grounds. And this is the vegetation as I found it, which they, of course, cleaned up, sadly. The communications tower from the Americans, the barracks, which are also from the Nazi period. And what I really decided to do then was to say, we said, okay, let's call this the Park of Encounters, because I felt that it was important to have this encounter with the history and at the same time weave in a maximum densification of contemporary uses for open space. So on the one side, a maximum of historical encounters. And what you see here is the concept actually from the competition: social encounters, historical encounters, and contextual encounters. And I'll focus today only on the historical encounters. And then on the other side, the maximum of contemporary uses so that it speaks to both sides of us. And this is the historical aspects of the site. What I did is I said, okay, there are all of these spaces and elements that are about control and power. That's what military occupation is. And I would like to keep those elements and make them the main storytelling of the park, but at the same time, transform them into places and elements of social encounter. So that this sort of double-edged sword of saying, when you walk in the space, what you perceive atmospherically and physically is the military history, but then you unfold in a more subtle way, tucked into that is a very big palette of these contemporary uses. And the reason I did that is I felt that sensing these spaces was important to reflecting the history, but also because our cities have become so generic. All the places look the same. Everyone puts a bit of lounge furniture or a catalog furniture and a few nice trees and whatever. And I think cities need to be a place of differentiation. They need this storytelling. They need to tell us about their history and where they've become. So I'll just give you 2-3 examples from this matrix, which I also did for the competition. The oak tree is a very famous historic symbol for power and strength. The Nazis took it over as one of their symbols. I made it the main symbol of the main tree species of the park, and so to speak, gave it back to the German population. The eagle, the same historic symbol for power and strength. The Nazis took it over as their symbol. I give it back with a sound installation and a play with the surveillance cameras, also elements of power and control. I'll show you that to you in a moment, and so on and so forth. The fences were taken out, became seating walls. There's control cabins for the checkpoints, became play elements, etc. So that was the basic concept for the park. And I'll show you a few of these elements. Here are the Nazi eagles. That used to be a swastika below that. Control cabins from the Americans, where you had to stop with your vehicle. Furniture left over from the Americans, still kind of moss and thrown around there and left on site. The lamps from the 1970s from the Americans. Surveillance cameras came after 9/11, many on the site. This is a plan of the park, and you can see how one of the main task was just to make it even feel like a park, because these are actually leftover military spaces. So they're very fragmented. You have, can you see my cursor or not? If not, okay, it's probably difficult to see. So starting at the bottom in the center, you see the large space. That was the old parade grounds, element of power and control. I renamed it the Forum, which is a space of discourse, and made it so that many activities and people can be spending time there. To the left of that, the larger space is the riding grounds of the horses, also display of military power and control. I now renamed it to the Cultural Plaza, so to speak, where there are many startups and creative people, and there's films, out of doors, concerts, etc. I will explain these, just 4 or 5 of the names, just so you can imagine, and then I will show photos of the project and how I transformed these spaces. At the top, you see the larger green space. That was a former Nazi elite park where just the very elite people could stroll and have dinner and meet. It's now become a playground, and I've done very, very subtle interventions into the park so that it stays the way it was. And then, oh, sorry, just one last picture. You see here a vertical space connecting what I just said are the parade grounds or the Forum with this Nazi elite park, which is now called the Lounge, and it's next to student housing and other kind of uses, and I'll show you what I've done with these different spaces. So this is the picture. I forgot to say explicitly, but I'm sure you got the message. We were able to win the two-phase competition, and it just was finished being built last year. And so you'll see the pictures that are fairly recent of the park. This is a visualization from the competition of this new space from the forum, as I call it, the place of discourse. This is the Nazi elite park. I took former paving from the site and inserted very tiny little plazas around the park where the people doing research in the buildings around it, the students living in the buildings around it, the neighborhood, and so on could appropriate these small spaces, but the park would be left with its atmosphere. This is what I call the cultural market, using this space in front of the cultural activities and creative activities and so on. And here you see a little scheme that I made for the competition. These red lines show something that we call the red band, and that's a band, which I'll show you in a moment, a concrete paving, which unifies all of these spaces. So the main concept was, and you see here in the black little sketch, that the unique atmosphere and task historically of each of these spaces was kept to be its own unique voice of its historical usage as a military space. And I tried to with all the things I did. And the red band, so to speak, unites them all into being something that we can coherently understand as a park. Here, a photo of the site. You're looking at the forum below at the bottom. Then you see what I refer to as the lounge, connecting the space to the north. And in the north, the Nazi elite park. So you can see how these spaces all came together, and you see the red band connecting all of these spaces. This is only part of the park, but you can have a sense of the very different character of the spaces. So for the red band, we decided to shred the many, many pavements that were found on site. These are these sort of crappy concrete pavements you find from the Americans. They're also natural stone paving from the Nazi period and so on and so forth. So we said, okay, let's just shred them all up and we'll make this red band, and you will walk literally on history. You will walk on these stones. And you see here concrete and stone mixed together in tests for the colors. And this is how it looks in the end. We couldn't afford, of course, to make 5 meters width. This was a very expensive thing to do in the end. And it took many tests, but you see how this 80 centimeter wide band, it frames all of the main spaces and it leads you through the park. Here's another photo, a more zoomed in of this forum, and I'll just briefly describe the main characteristics that I invested in it. It's asymmetrical. It's shifted away from the symmetry, which is part of this control and the rationale of the military. And it's left empty for large festivals, which they have there. But you'll see closer to the building, you see these, whatever, 30-meter high flag. Sorry, I mixed my German and English. I'm sorry. The flag poles, you see the signage from the Americans, the polars from the Americans. You see these strange fragments which are left completely in discordance with the new design. And it was something that I really cared about, is the layering and the frictions between the different layers of time. And at the same time, surrounding that is a green space full of trees. These are the oak, some of the oak trees, which are just very tiny there. And we've used ecological principles of retaining water and so on, but the people can literally sit around the edge and have picnics and join each other, but also use the space, which has a very strange character. And I purposely made this space 90 meters in width. Originally, it was 120 meters. It was huge. And when I decided on the width, I literally walked back and forth until I found the size that was uncomfortable. Because if I had made it comfortable, let's say 80 meters width, 75 meters, it would have become nice. And then we would have said, oh, it's some paving, it's a plaza. But instead, with the 90 meters, it brings you into a state of unrest and lets you ask questions. What happened here? Why is it so big? Why is it overly big? So these are the kind of questions that interest me. Here's a picture during construction in winter, looking quite sad, but you see this emptiness. There's a fountain there you're looking at with no water. You see the flagpoles, and you see this great emptiness in its strangeness. And here's a kid playing on the site, on the fountain. Then at the Nazi military park, what I told you, the elite park, I left everything I could. And you see here these little circle pavings, which are places for the people to appropriate. There's chairs and tables, which we unfortunately had to chain down. And the people really take over these spaces. They're completely full. And you see here the paving where I made compositions out of the pavings from all the different eras and put them together to form these places that are like talking to you. They're speaking to us. For the lounge, it's this thin space connecting the major spaces. To the left, you see one of the old barracks from the 1930s. That will become student housing. It's not there yet. And behind us, the main building, which I showed you in the beginning, will become a school. And you see all the barracks buildings around. And I found this American furniture, the lamps and the benches and so on, I found them so charming in their historical aura that I decided to make something called the lounge, which is an informal place for meeting of students, but also passersby, the researchers, the neighbors, et cetera, and that they would just collect in these kind of spaces. And you see these kind of cartoons which we made. I felt it was important to express the social uses of the spaces through these cartoons to communicate this during the competition. And here you see a photo also during the construction site. Everything's quite young, but you see the space with the furniture and the lamps, and it has really its own character, and it's very charming. And now the neighbors really come and fill up this space and love to meet here and sit casually and so on.
Robin, unfortunately, our time is up, so if you could please come towards an end.
Okay, I will.
Thank you.
This is a checkpoint, and you see here the radii where the people checked, and this it's become a huge playground with different kind of spaces. Here are the old checkpoint cabins, hiding garden, lounge for the teenagers, and other spaces to meet. And as the last layer, it's taking this furniture on the red band that becomes a seating landscape. And it's the only layer that's really colorful and new, and it adds a new dimension to the park and guides us around. And as my last image, I would just like to show, I won't go into it today, but this is a sound installation at the entrance plaza where I collected all the surveillance cameras and put in original sound fragments from the 1930s to 2013. And you walk among these different posts and you can hear original fragments of Hitler and concentration camps and Nuremberg trials, but also Bob Dylan, television, and so on. And so it gives this space a whole other meaning and a very direct contact to its history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. If you could please stay with us for a conversation later. And yes, I love the way you say that it's about storytelling and about the different identities in the city. I think it's something that we really can learn from here in Israel. But now I want to invite Dr. Ada Victoria Segre, which I'm honored to have here because she was my teacher. And I'm very grateful for the knowledge she gave me in this field. So a bit about Dr. Segre. She is a highly respected expert in landscape architecture and historic garden conservation with an advanced degree from prestigious institutions, including a PhD in historic parks and garden conservation from the University of York. Her work explores the evolution and preservation of historic Italian gardens and landscape, and she's held key teachings and research roles, including in the Technion, focusing on historical garden conservation, and is also an ICOMOS committee in the ICOMOS Committee of Israel. Please, Ada.
Good afternoon to everyone. Well, I'm afraid you're going to hear a little bit more about Independence Garden, but I'm very grateful to Tali because I can skip some of the historical background. The subject of this conversation is really materials, essential materials which build up our design landscape. Not only design, natural and design, art and nature in this case. And of course, I chose one material for the hard landscape and a couple of species for the soft landscape due to the fact that we don't have time to screen all the possible plantings and so on. I think that for Tel Aviv and for some other coastal cities in Israel, one of the main hard landscape materials we are dealing with is what we call kurkar. I'll just give you some background for those who are not familiar with this material, especially for our friends abroad. Kurkar is a type of sedimentary aeolian sandstone with a carbonate cement that forms elongated subparallel ridges along the coastal plain region. These ridges are essentially fossilized dunes created around a billion years ago, but really they are of many ages, even 5,000 years ago, when sea sand dunes transformed into aeolianite rock, also known, which is known as kurkar. Basically, it is sand dunes which have undergone a process of fossilization, which have absorbed quartz sand coming from a distance, and they've turned into rock. The whole coast of Israel, basically from the south as far as the southern slopes of the Mount Carmel, is really crossed by ridges of kurkar. Some of them are on the coastline, some of them are a little bit more inland. And Tel Aviv is no exceptions. What I would like to say, and my claim is that this material has penetrated the world of planning and building in many ways, including the world of landscape design. I'll show a few examples. And following that, my plea would be to pay attention to the ridges that still exist as ridges inside the city, which should be protected, and of course the ridges on the coast, and the material that has been used in garden design, especially for garden details. I'll show you a few examples in a minute, which have now become rare because the excavation of kurkar is now forbidden since 1965. The reason for this limitation is that they started using kurkar as a, substrate for not only for footpaths in gardens but also for road, and that was destroying the natural ridges. So basically, it's become a rare material, and this has implication on conservation issues. Here you see, I'm sorry, we didn't know we were talking about the same thing. This is the ridge on which Independence Garden is constructed on top. You can see the beautiful porous and layered rock, which has many good qualities, also some bad qualities. And let's see the next one, please. Is it at a set time that no, that you change? Okay, stop here. Yes. Okay. Okay. Here are some examples. I'm afraid it's not very clear of how kurkar pieces were used in historic gardens in Tel Aviv. You have the addresses. You can see that coping the garden bed edge is the most common use, usually coping it in a sort of crazy paving manner, sort of irregular pieces, but in this case, like in Ben-Gurion 79, it's really a pattern. It's been cut. You can see the one in Ben-Gurion 81, and then you can see the use of kurkar for retaining walls, dry walls. This is in Chalam 80, the corner with Maze 40. And the best example for seen a variety of views. This is Balfour 65. You can see the same use for the edges, and also the use of small pieces of rock that were used in gardens as small rockeries. So you have bigger rockeries, rock gardens, but also small rockeries. גם זה וגם זה? Multitasking. Okay. So in fact, you have regularly and formally attached pieces of kurkar in the gardens, but also free, small rocks that used to form rockeries, small ones, but they're now lost. Nobody knows why, and so they throw them on the side. One of the things that conservation should be after there is more awareness about this material is to collect these rocks and to try to reuse them, since we cannot really excavate them again. Next, please. I should have done it, sorry. Okay, here you have General Hill Square, and you can see how much kurkar rocks is used for the cascades and for a sort of rock garden platform. It's used everywhere. Next one. Also in Prophet's Gardens, now called Dora Gimpel's Garden, but historic names. And you can see how kurkar was the main material of gardens, historic gardens in Tel Aviv. Now I'll try to be quick in talking about Independence Garden. This is before Independence Gardens was created. You can see the ridge with the building of the Muslim cemetery. That is a sort of maqam. It's a quite high ridge compared to others. And here you can see the Haganah Yonah camp that was there in 1947 and 48, just after the British camp had been abandoned. So the next one. Here you can see the garden in the process of being built. You can see the sand dunes and the use of the rocks all over the place. I think you've seen this picture, and probably you've seen the next one, so we'll go through it. But the next one I think you need to see, and you can see how beautiful the kurkar rock is. And I'm not going into details of how many types of kurkar there are, because the layering can be different, the porosity can be different, the size of the texture can be of different sizes. Here you see another place. This is a 1952 picture from the top of the ridge. This is at the bottom of the ridge. Sorry, this is towards Hayarkon. It's on the other side, on the eastern side of the garden. And it's also an historic picture. Next one, please. You've seen this, and Talia has already said that this was sort of basically compacted kurkar, and probably there was also sand and other materials that was compacted, and there was no real material that would keep it together. And therefore, this picture is probably in the 4 or 5 years after the opening. You can see that there are already sort of streams caused by water. So it doesn't, it needs constant maintenance, as all footpaths and gardens did. But on top of that, we cannot use kurkar nowadays in such large quantities. So let's go to the next. Okay, just I would like to add just a few things following what Professor Tal Alon Moses has said. The reason Zvi Deckel was assigned the restoration of the garden is because when he was 16, he worked with Abraham Abi Caravan in building this very same garden. So basically, he knew how the garden had been built. He was very, very close to Abi Caravan and to his son Dani because they were the same age. They studied together. They went to the kibbutz Harel together. So basically, they were very, very intimate, and they also worked together. So basically, it was a logical choice to choose Zvi Deckel for the restoration or the regeneration of this park. He used two professionals for two purposes. One, I will just mention him. He did an exceptionally good work, but I'm not going to analyze it. Is Israel Drori, who did the planting design. Not only the planting design. He researched the old plants, found out which plants were original, and so on and so on. So there was a real research behind it, and then produced the planting design. Generally speaking, the plants are halophytes, are drought resistant and salt spray resistant, but that's all I'm going to say about this. The other person who was really pivotal for this work was Emmanuel Arbaz, who did basically the various mixtures of concrete and kurkar powder to see which combination suited best, and that's how most of the garden is paved, not all of it. Let's see. This is 2005, before the restoration, and after. You can see that the design has basically remained the same. The layout, only it's a sort of regeneration of materials and planting, and of course of the footpaths. Next, please. Okay, if you look at the ridge from the coast, you can see a retaining wall cladded with kurkar stone in a crazy paving configuration. You can see the natural ridge with a protective net because it crumbles. And there you can recognize the pilot memorial on top of the ridge. So basically, you have a whole show of the garden from underneath. It's not only the garden, it's the ridge itself from the coast. Next, please. Yes. Now we have to mention another type of rock. Kurkar is the most famous and the most abundant. But we also have Even Yam, which is sea stone in a free translation, which is also similar in composition to the kurkar, but the conditions in which it is formed are different. It's more compact. It has some more minerals, but particularly it has a lot of shells. And it's formed at the bottom of the sea. So this was also used for gardens, but not in the same extent. The ones that you see here, here is the kurkar and here is the Even Yam, were brought to this garden because Zvi Deckel learned that they were dismantling the stones from Charles Clore Garden, which is located in a southern position. And they went and they took those stones and reused them here. So basically, if we want to be precise, we have two kinds of stones. One is Even Yam, is sea stone, and the other one is kurkar. Next. Okay, this is the sort of, I hope, maybe if you switch off the light, you can see that it's combed cement, it's combed concrete. so that it seems like, it looks like kurkar, and these are the parts that have not been paved. So there is a combination of paved footpaths and unpaved footpath in this garden. Next, please. You can see here the texture. Next. And here you can see a part that has kurkar, a real kurkar, but it's been cut and recomposed. It's not a real natural one. And here is the regenerated concrete kurkar-like stone. When they couldn't have the real thing, this is what they did. Next one. And here is one of the staircases which combines natural kurkar here with this sort of concrete combined material which seems to match. I'm not sure I like it very much. I don't know what you think about it, but there is an attempt to create an artificial material which blends with the natural one. Next. All right. About one other thing that I was told by Zvi Deckel about the plants was one of the problems was the invasion of shrubby saltbush, in Hebrew, maluach kipeach. Very, very large bushes that had covered everything. So he told me that they found a creeping variety, a low one, that wouldn't be so invasive. I looked for it, but I couldn't find it, I'm sorry to say. Okay, next. And of course, you know, the use of tamaric safila is typical of caravans work near the sea, and this is a good example. Halophyte vegetation, okay? I think this is the last one for this, yes. Okay. This will be quick. We have a native material for the hard landscape in Tel Aviv. But if we are looking for the characterizing trees in Tel Aviv, the trees are not native. And we can take into consideration two species of the same genus. One is a sycamore fig, in Hebrew, Etz Shikma. And the other one is, of course, Ficus ashderot, which is now called Ficus microcarpa. Changed many names. And in this case, I just show you, well, this is the oldest tree, probably the oldest tree in Tel Aviv, the sycamore fig between Maze, go to the next one, I'll tell you the number here, 56, 58, and Oliphant 8. It's a huge, huge plant. It's probably more than 200 years old. I'm sorry to say there are difficulties in conserving it as an entity, because there is a possibility of conserving parts of the roots according to the properties in which the roots are in, but not the tree as a whole. So this is a problem. Next one. Of course, here, if you've seen in King George, I won't go into the history of the sycamore figs, but they are the oldest figs in Tel Aviv, basically. Their presence is known to have been in the area before Tel Aviv was formed. Okay, so next one, only two. And of course, this garden, Gan Yaakov, Jacob's Gardens, is basically revolves around 3 historical sycamore figs, and it's a really homage to this kind of tree. We could talk about it quite longer, but I have only 1 minute left, so the next one. Next one. Next one. And just a couple of words about the Ficus השדרות, Ficus microcarpa. Next one, please. Okay. No, wait, stop here. It's important to understand that this kind of fig, which more or less entered the ornamental world in Tel Aviv and in this area, was conceived as a plant that you can train and prune in topiary. That was the initial idea. And if you see this postcard, 1940s, I would say, of Sderot Rothschild, you can see that the trees are pruned straight. Same thing happened in Bloch Boulevard in the Weizmann Institute. So basically, ideally, at the beginning, they thought this was a sort of replacement of, I don't know, boxwood, or any plant that you can prune and give a shape. And for this reason, for many years, these plants didn't produce any fruit. They didn't produce any fruit because also the wasp, the specific fig wasp, didn't arrive to Israel until the mid-1960s. And this is a problem because the fruits are eaten by fruit bats, and the fruit bats spit on the facades of the buildings, so it's a conservation problem, basically. But keeping them pruned lowers the quantity of fruits, or flowers and fruits. And I won't go into the biology of all this, but in order to produce the fruit, they need this specific wasp. So basically what was a very popular tree because it grew fast, it cast a lot of shadow at the beginning of our history here, or well, in the early days of Tel Aviv, has become a difficult task for a difficult component of maintenance, because it's an aggressive tree that grows very with aggressive roots, and if it's not pruned, it can become quite huge. So this is an example of a historic plant which characterizes the urban landscape of Tel Aviv, which has become a sort of problematic tree maintenance-wise. Okay, I think this is it for today. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you, Ada. I'm always amazed to see how we are not alone in the city. We are in a complete ecosystem, no? And sometimes now I learned that, well, maybe the Shrebi Maluch Kiper will take over, so we have to be careful in what we plant and what the outcome will be. I just really think it's so interesting to understand that you know, nature has its own sort of language, and we are only guests here. Anyway, Marcel Krüger is our next speaker. He's based in Berlin and was part of our field trip to Urban Futures projects, which we did last year. I'm very happy to introduce you, Marcel. He's a landscape architect and urban designer, studied in the TU Berlin and Versailles. He is founder of Studio Erde, Office of Anthropocene Landscape, a design agency working on the interdisciplinary projects in between landscape, ecology, and urban design. Please, Marcel, if you can join, that would be nice.
So, yeah, I switched to English. I just wanted to say hello in Hebrew, first of all. Yeah, I want to talk today about a shared project we at Studio Erde are doing together also with Robin and Bell Architects from Cologne for Haus der Statistik in Berlin, a very central part of the cooperative project Haus der Statistik. I will especially talk about public space at the intersection between heritage and experiment. And yes, so before maybe just some short notes about us, about who we are. We are Studio Erde. It's me, Marcel Tröger, as already introduced by Sharon and Violetta. and we have offices in Berlin and Zurich, and we are working for or towards the landscape architecture in the Anthropocene. We believe that our picture of the landscape, this romantic picture a lot of us still have in a way, is kind of broken, and we have to rethink our attitude and responsibility in this new in this new era, and that's why with our project, and especially also the House of Statistic project I will share with you in a minute, we are thinking and we are trying to develop a new critical attitude towards designing, and are questioning how and which different ways can we design within different scales and with also different different actors. And this is also part of the project for the statistic, where we also were trying strongly to work not only with maybe things we already know, landscape architecture, plants, soil, but also with other metabolic systems and actors, also such as animals, energy, infrastructure, but also a lot rituals and practices. House of Statistic, our project City as Stage, or Catalyst of Imagination. It's a project for two main squares adjacent to Alexanderplatz. So we are right in the heart, in a way. Berlin doesn't really have a center, but it's the historic center of Berlin. It's also a center in a way of democratic expression. You can see a picture of the uprisings of the opposition movement of the GDR in the end of the 80s and 89, where they occupied actually those two squares and Alexanderplatz. Haus der Statistik is this building, and this is Haus des Reisens, House of the Travel. And they use the space as sort of democratic expression. What is interesting about this urban design scheme and about the whole situation you can find today, that it was part of a battle in a way between Western and Eastern ways of how to produce urban landscape design in the city. The Karl-Marx-Allee, or formerly known as Stalin-Allee, where Haus der Statistik and Haus des Reisens are in a way the heads of this alley. You can see on the right a picture of GDR architects on a model of Stalin-Allee. It's a modernist and very opulent housing axis over several kilometers. In a way, in a quotation on how they interpret Schinkel's architecture. On the other hand, and this was right after the war, so actually whole Berlin was bombed, or a lot of Berlin was bombed. And they had to rethink a lot what how a city should look like. So those are some of those pictures they produced. They combined this with this idea of a national reconstruction program, and they did like a very in a very crazy speed. They achieved those this project. On the other hand, some years later, the Western architects kind of responded to this notion of the Eastern communist urban design, and they planned and did do this. They called it Interbau, the International Building Exhibition in '57. I guess a lot of you know it maybe in Hansaviertel, which is adjacent to Tiergarten. This is a model on the left side of those architects. We had very famous architects there, Alvar Aalto, and many others, Egon Eiermann. And they kind of translated their idea of a modernist urbanism according to the Charta of Athens into this design. So we had of those two, and they were very different attitudes. But both of those structures, in a way, Berlin wanted to transform into and apply it for the status of UNESCO World Heritage, which is in a way very interesting because it's very young. It's very young architectures, also very different. They didn't succeed because I think I read some explanations that it wasn't innovative enough, which I found interesting. but for our project Haus der Statistik, which is the picture on the bottom right, which is kind of this head towards Karl Marx Allee, this big axis. In the workshop procedure, because it wasn't an open competition, it was an invited workshop procedure, we were tackled with this task on how to integrate also heritage questions into a more experimental approach towards landscape architecture. Haus der Statistik, some short slides about the project itself. It's in itself a very interesting project because it's actually a bottom-up initiative by artists, architects, and different stakeholders who in 2015, so the picture on the upper right, they kind of tried to save this building, this Haus der Statistik, from demolition. They formed a big initiative. They worked closely together with Raumlabor, also an interesting architecture collective in Berlin, and they produced this vision, which is on the left, of a neighborhood where this Haus der Statistik, this building, kind of gets a new center. It's and which tries with different means, with a lot of local stakeholders trying to build a city differently. So they started to create, and first of all, they were successful in keeping this building. And then they built up a big network of local actors. They call them pioneers, a lot of associations who work inside this vacant building ensemble. And they occupy this building. They worked with this building in this interim phase. And they developed new strategies on how to live, how to coexist together. But they also translated this 2 years ago into an urban design proposal, where a big part of this proposal was to develop, and this I think is also interesting for Tel Aviv, how to actually, out of a legal perspective, create a framework for experiments and for another way in how to produce cityscapes. They developed this network, which consists of city actors from the government, from the Senate, but also from the local governments in the quarter, because Berlin has like different quarters. Real estate companies who share a big part of the buildings there, but of course a lot of citizens, artists, and they founded this COP5, they call this, which is like the central structure, and this enables them to develop projects, to develop this urban neighborhood, but also to launch this project, which I now in the second part of this short lecture I want to talk about. They launched this project for the temporary activation and redesign of Haus der Statistik, Haus des Reisens, of the public spaces. We teamed up, as I said in the beginning already, with Robin, who also will probably happily share some insights later on. And we teamed up also with Anne-Julien Bernert from Bell Architects from Cologne, who's also an expert in the participative design process. This is a little sketch also from on the top from one of the workshops. City as stage, catalyst of imagination. So this is the model we developed for this workshop, which served as a very colorful model to take with a lot of, or to kind of showcase in a very easy way our interventions. We worked, as I already said, we worked at this edge of Karl Marx Allee, but also kind of closely to Alexanderplatz. So we had to kind of integrate ourselves in this logic of the urban structure. But we were also looking deeply at what actually was happening there. What is interesting is that the GDR, by what I already showed before, by building this Karl Marx Allee neighborhood, they erased almost entirely the whole historic city structure of the historical structure of Berlin. So you almost lost any reference to what was there before. However, you can still find a lot of traces in the soil. You find traces of churches which were moved and erased. You find a lot of infrastructure beneath. You find tunnels. There's a big network of tunnels beneath Alexanderplatz and also beneath our squares. So we played with those revealed objects and traces, but we also played with those different networks we found, as I already kind of showed you, the social network which was there. So how, in a way, can the social network can be related to this spatial network and those hidden objects? That's why we identified and played with some cards. We call them play cards. And we identified 15 objects, hidden or maybe existing objects, which will serve as main protagonists of our design scheme. We didn't propose a complete or complete transformation of the squares, but a very, very precise and sometimes only acupunctural reactivation of specific objects. This is kind of a strategy we worked with. We see the objects in a way as stage. They kind of create a strong relationship to one another. Trees, which kind of combine those objects, and then the actors, which come in and change the whole scheme always. This is a layout plan of the design. I will just go briefly through it now and with some focuses. This is kind of an object tableau we did for the competition, for the workshop, and also now for the work to go on, where we kind of specialized and kind of focused on those different objects. What was a big part was thinking this project as a process. So as I said, it's a temporary project. And this temporality gave us also an option or gave us a framework to test out new things. And I think this is also very important or can be important for Tel Aviv, that temporality enables also, or is a vehicle actually for testing out new things. So we had, in a way, a time frame of 5 years where we work, first of all, with in the first phase with marking and activation of those traces. Then kind of how those traces can be built, but also can be accentuated by plans. And then in a way, how they, maybe after they are rebuilt, how they but still dynamize and kind of have an impulse towards the neighborhood. A big part was also to integrate those objects into, and I come also now to the last slides, how to integrate those objects into also local metabolic flows. So a big goal of the project was also to build with how can I say that, with the least new materials as possible. This also contained plants. We're working together with a local tree nursery, Lorberg, which is one of the biggest tree nurseries in Germany, and they give us for free trees. And this is a picture on the right from one of the site visits there. Trees which they usually would throw away because they are not perfectly grown. They have some mistakes, and we reintegrate them. It's also part of an art project my office partner Violetta is doing together with Andreas Greiner. It's called Wild Woods. I'm sorry, I think you hear my little daughter Tal. She's screaming a bit. Sorry for that. Another part is also not only to reuse plants, but also to reuse water and energy. So our objects, they also create energy. For instance, there's this pavilion which Bell Architects is doing, which accentuates a tunnel underground situation, which sits on an underground tunnel, and which kind of accentuates this hidden infrastructure, which produces energy through PV panels on this pavilion, but also which collects rainwater and then serves for watering of the trees nearby. But also this XX structure, which is a direct reference to a GDR sculpture which was there, which also serves as a rainwater collector. We worked a lot with those aesthetics of temporality and those different actions who come with this strategy. And also this idea on how to integrate local materials. We are building furnitures out of local materials. But here, which is interesting, we are referring to a chair type, which was an historical design prototype for the Alexanderplatz, which a steel art designer did, and we are trying to reinterpret this chair by using local reused material. Also in terms of how to, with very tiny interventions, for instance, this idea of polishing, how can we also accentuate the existing pavings? A lot of the square is covered with this concrete pavings, and we are proposing this idea of a performance of a collective polishing for one of the axes. You can see like a little material experiment we did some month ago, where suddenly almost a terrazzo atmosphere is being created through a very tiny intervention. It's all kind of also integrated within this idea of a curational network. We developed this framework, and I think this is also an interesting part also for Tel Aviv maybe, and for more experimental projects, that of course you need also, and this is the last slide, you need for testing out those experimental projects, you need actors who you can rely on. You need to build sort of network of actors who will care for those spaces. And that's why we proposed in a way an amuta, like a corporation, which serves as curators for the development of those sites. This is last slide, as I said, this was a first activation last November, where we did a lyrical promenade at night, where we light our different interventions, and where we read poems on those interventions to kind of give a glimpse in a potential future. So currently we are in the phases of permission, and we hope that in the next month there will be first results we can share with you. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Marcel. So I think it's, again, very important to understand that we would also like to engage community in the activity of the public space. And how do we do it? It's a very interesting, possibility that you showed us with public participation. Last speaker, we always have one too many, but I'm sure this one will be super interesting, is Professor Elisa Rosenberg. She is an accomplished academic landscape architect with an expertise in cultural landscape and a design educator. Her research is in teaching focuses on the role of landscape in the urban development of cultural identity. After Elisa, I'm afraid we won't have too much time to speak, so we will just take a break and come together for a workshop. So please, Elisa.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, even though there's one too many speakers. But I hope you'll stay with me with this story that I want to tell, basically. In a minute, we'll get the images. But I really want to tell, as you'll see, I'm going to be talking about a project that takes us into very different territory. But I really hope to kind of resurface some themes from this morning about Gettys. And I think that there's some very interesting issues that will come out of this particular project. Could we get the full screen, please? I'm going to be talking about West Philadelphia Landscape Project, which is a project that was led and developed by the landscape architect and educator Ann Whiston Spurn, who was a student of Ian McHarg's and currently teaches at MIT and has taught at a number of places, Harvard and Penn as well. And maybe before we get the images, what I really wanted to kind of bring up from the morning in terms of the Gettys themes is this kind of bridging of worlds that Gettys managed to do between the cultural and the physical landscapes, which is something that is really interesting in this particular project. And the second theme that I want to bring up is the bridging of scales. And it's something that Elsfer Bakel talked about that is so remarkable in the Getty's plan for the small parks in Tel Aviv, the intimacy of scale that we have, and not only the parks, but of course the whole play of the Tel Aviv, the Getty's block within the system of blocks in Tel Aviv, is all about a kind of nesting of scales and a kind of brilliant way of working from the small to the intermediate to the large. And so what I want to talk about here is the ways in which individual scale and scale of neighborhood plays out at the scale of the city, and to look at a very interesting story in a minute that I will, whoops, we can't get the full screen here. Control L. But I can't advance the slides either. Oh, wait a minute. No. I'm not able to advance the slides, but maybe can you advance the slide? Can we get the next slide? Okay. So I'll just kind of give you a bit of a background to this project. It's really a community project, and a lot of what I want to talk about is process, actually. And I also want to talk about the kind of interesting framework in which this project developed, which is a collaboration between academia, and community, which had very far-reaching political implications and applications. And I say this now as we embark on a similar kind of project with Bezalel and Liebling, where we're kind of using the power of the critical minds of students to kind of develop groundwork for rethinking ways in which we want to see the future of Tel Aviv. So I think this project is very apropos of that particular project. Okay, all right, yay. If we can I advance it now? Okay, but if we could, all right, the lights. Okay, we can't really see the phrasing, the quote. What Anne Spirn really developed in this project is something that she calls place-based education. And it's really about building local knowledge as a basis for activist planning. And I just want to read this quote from Anne Spirn, because as a kind of opening here, the language of landscape is a powerful tool. It permits people to perceive pasts that they cannot otherwise experience, to anticipate the possible, to envision, choose, and shape the future landscape. So with that, I want to talk about this project called West Philadelphia Landscape Project, which took place in a very tough neighborhood in West Philadelphia, which is now a gentrifying neighborhood, in fact, not far from Penn, headed up by Anne Spirn, who, as I mentioned, is both an educator and a researcher. And what's remarkable is the kind of length of the project. She's been working on it for about 30 years and has had a very long-term relationship with one community, which is very rare. And she's been working with design students and members of the community in what's called the Mill Creek neighborhood, which has really served as a kind of incubator for design experimentation and also activism. The project operates along a couple of parallel tracks. One is community design, the other is education, and finally research. And one of the concepts that she develops that I think is really powerful, and it very much resonates, I think, with Patrick Getty's, is this idea of landscape literacy. I want to also, I will talk about how through a process of landscape literacy within the community itself, there was an advocacy that ultimately ended up in developing a groundbreaking policy report for Philadelphia in 2011 called Green City, Clean Waters, Combined Sewer Long-Term Control Plan, and which fundamentally reoriented the city's approach to stormwater management towards what we call nature-based solutions that she had been advocating. So, but what I really want to start with is this idea of how landscape plays such an important role in cementing identity and belonging, and what we can begin to think about as something called place-based education. So this idea of landscape literacy, this idea that Spurn really develops, came out of her work with the community, and it's all about reading the landscape in all of its complexity, which is both physical, environmental, and political, which is fundamental. And it's more than that, it's about empowering people to tell a new story about the landscape. And I think this is what's so interesting, is that notion of agency that was so central to the project. She bases this idea on the ideas of the Brazilian educator and political activist Paulo Freire and Donald Macedo, who recognized the transformative potential of verbal literacy as a form of cultural politics. And they said, she quoted them saying that reading always involves critical perception, interpretation, and the rewriting of what is read. So she took this idea of verbal literacy and applied it to the landscape as a way of teaching people how to read their own landscapes, as a way of empowering them to understand their own urban environments. And this is the work in Mill Creek, the low-income community, that was a kind of model of a catalog of the failures of 20th century planning, really. Another thought that was really kind of key here about verbal literacy, and this is a quote of Spurn's, as verbal literacy was a cornerstone of the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, landscape literacy empowered Mill Creek residents to recognize and redress injustices embodied in their landscape and to build pride and self-confidence. And more than that, she says that landscape literacy is a prerequisite to ecological design and planning as a democratic enterprise. So let's look at what this project actually set out to do. She calls it a kind of action research, which she explains or she defines as a way of testing and generating theory in a real-world context. And Spurn, as you may know, wrote a very influential book in 1984 called The Granite Garden, looking at how cities could be rebuilt in concert with natural processes. And what she's looking at here, though, she wants to ask the next sort of follow-up question, and that is, what does it mean to restore urban nature in terms of a kind of social agenda? And how can restoring urban nature actually be leveraged to rebuild low-income communities? So this was the question that kind of fueled a whole series of landscape architecture design studios that Spurn taught at Harvard in the 1980s to start to explore the social dimensions of restoring natural urban systems. And she began by setting her studios in Boston, since she was teaching at Harvard, and they were looking at vacant lots, and they were looking at vacant lots within the city as opportunities to rethink what could be actually added to the city. And in her study of these vacant lots, a very interesting pattern emerged. And what they found, that vacancy is not random, but it seemed to be, or even the result of such things as arson as typically was thought. But what she found is that vacancy was very highly correlated with topography and hydrologic processes. And so this is where these two worlds start coming together, where they began to see that many of the vacant lots in the neighborhoods were located in wet valley bottoms where a creek had been buried under the street, very often in some type of sewage project, urban sewer. And what happened was that through historical research of kind of examining the hidden buried creeks, what they began to find is in these places of collapse and abandonment, instability, typically there was a wetness that was really had to do with an urban buried floodplain. And she began to find that this was a wider urban phenomenon, not unique only to Boston. And so this led her to the question of how to begin to link questions of urban flooding and water infrastructure as a way to promote neighborhood redevelopment. So she began this, she continued this research in Philadelphia. When she moved to Penn, she began teaching at University of Pennsylvania, and she was chair of the landscape architecture department there. And she began to get involved with the Mill Creek neighborhood, which I'm showing here. And what we can see here in blue are the buried creek of Mill Creek. So she began with a 4-year program looking at designing community gardens on vacant lots, but then began to discover this pattern of the buried stream, and this led to a lot of historic research to uncover its location and to also inform the residents of this history. The creek had been buried in a combined sewer system in the 1880s, and the floodplain was filled and built upon, causing subsidence, instability, and abandonment, just like she found in Boston. And the combined system caused a citywide problem with sewage flowing directly into Philadelphia's Schuylkill River during heavy rain events. The pipe was no longer large enough to carry both sanitary sewage and stormwater. Instead of reaching the treatment plant during heavy rains, the combined sewage and rainwater overflowed into the river, causing severe pollution. This is a phenomenon we see in very many urban cities in America. So here is just some examples of the kind of research that they were doing, looking at historic maps. On the left, we see the creek by in 1872. Then we see by 1927, we no longer have any evidence of the creek. And a lot of the work that was done online to actually recreate the topography that was not available at the time. This information was not available through the municipalities, so there was a lot of sort of reconstruction of topographic information. And then the students began to work online with a kind of interactive website so that neighbors could see where they lived. They could actually choose a site and on the map and understand where they were relative to this creek. And we can also see the correlation between the location of the creek and vacant lots. What you see in all of these squares are the vacant lots in the neighborhood, and you get a kind of flavor for what the neighborhood looks like. But we see this clear correlation. Oops. So the project, as Spurn describes it, was not a form of community service. She wasn't doing this simply to benefit the community, as often is done in university settings, but she really wanted to use it as a real-world laboratory to test out some research questions. And the primary question was how to find synergies between restoring hydrologic systems and rebuilding community. Water systems were viewed as a critical lever. Rather than relying on single-use engineering solutions for the problem of sewage overflows, nature-based solutions were proposed to provide added value to the neighborhood in the form of new open space that doubled as floodplain protection and flood control. The significant budgets earmarked for stormwater management in the city could then do double duty, not only reducing the combined sewer overflows and restoring water quality, but also creating a ribbon of parks over the buried creek. And so I'll show you here just a few examples of student work. This was the result of years of studios of all kinds of proposals for these kinds of open spaces that also did double duty as nature-based solutions, in other words, of storing water in open space and providing for both uses. And you can see some examples, further examples of the studies that were provided in the first phase of work done by students that led to a proposal for the West Philadelphia Landscape Plan, looking at these networks of urban parks, some images above, what they can look like. We can see that above. And we have, again, more analysis of the interrelatedness of these systems on a citywide, or at least a watershed scale. And we also see the kind of local implementation and the physical kind of expression of what they might look like. This is, again, student work. Some of this work also had to do with designing community gardens. This is one example that you see here. This was done later. So it had a kind of multifaceted aspect to it. So one thing that was very interesting about what was happening with this work is that all of this work that I showed you previously led up to a plan, but the plan was never adopted by the city, and which led to incredible frustration. And yet, it led also to a very interesting second phase of the project that I want to now talk about. So Spurn began to realize that she needed to focus on education. And she started to ask a second research question, which is how could local youth be engaged and empowered to affect neighborhood change? In other words, if all of this work wasn't getting anywhere at the level of the city, something more fundamental had to happen first. So she took it back to the level of the neighborhood, and she entered the schools in the neighborhood, a middle school that she began to develop a relationship with and develop a curriculum that went on for a number of years. And I think this is one of the really fascinating aspects of the project as well. So she says it's not enough to advocate for participatory planning. We need a more durable framework that could address capacity building. Capacity building and knowledge building. So in the second phase of the research, which was from 94 to 2002, Spurn developed a curriculum for Mill Creek's middle school with her students from Penn and later from MIT, where she later began to teach when she joined the MIT faculty in the year 2000. And the students learned about the creek that flowed through their neighborhood and that was buried under their school. And until then, interestingly, environmental studies always focused on nature, somebody else's nature, somewhere out there, somewhere in the suburbs, somewhere in the countryside. And the idea that nature was local was right there under their school, in their neighborhood, that the dense urban landscape could be studied in the same way, first met with a lot of resistance, interestingly enough. And so the students learned about urban processes that shape their own landscape. And beyond that, by examining primary sources, historic documents, plans, photographs, newspaper articles, and contemporary plans. And all of this paved the way for, they read documents from the 1930s that paved the way for the bank's discriminatory lending practices in black neighborhoods known as redlining. And so they started to learn their local history all through the lens of what had happened in the neighborhood with the hydrologic framework of the creek. They created websites, they built models, and their newfound understanding of the ecological and political forces that led to the disinvestment of their neighborhood equipped them to ask new questions and make new proposals that were ultimately presented to public officials and documented on their own project website, which attracted over 1 million visits. And so this work culminated in a multi-agency proposal submitted in 2001 for a $34 million project to redevelop Mill Creek Public Housing as a demonstration project that would provide an environmental study area for the school and integrate stormwater management measures to reduce combined sewer overflows. And they received funding and it moved forward. So what was even more here are some images of the kids, and if one looks at their website, it's really actually very moving to see the kind of work that they did and the incredible confidence that this project gave them to do work that was far more sophisticated and critical than anything they had done before. And so finally, this work culminated in a very important planning study that I mentioned in 2011 called for the Philadelphia Water Department to reduce combined sewer overflows. And I think this is the sort of the finale of this story, as it were, to show that through this very long process, ultimately, there was an incredible change of consciousness, an actual plan that was adopted by the city through a very protracted and very painstaking, but very meaningful project at the local level. So I'll just conclude by saying that this project tells the story of a remarkably tenacious and long-standing effort to create new partnerships to affect social and environmental change. This action research project brought together academic institutions, public agencies, and politicians with members of the local community, and was sustained over an unusually long time, which almost never happens. Most partnerships, academic partnerships, are very short-lived, and they create expectations that very often can't be fulfilled. And so what's remarkable about the project is its long-term commitment to a single community that provided this rare continuity that allowed for significant gathering of local knowledge and a platform for a meaningful interaction with local officials. So I just to maybe conclude then with this idea of landscape literacy, and to bring it back to a notion of place-based education that's both ecological and social and cultural, as a way of empowering citizens to participate meaningfully in their communities. Thank you.
So thank you, Elisa. It was really interesting. I love the idea of place-based education. And I think we have seen a full spectrum of ideas in our lectures, ranging from the actual landscape design here in Israel, which was done in Tel Aviv, and specific examples of materials, bottom-up processes, storytelling issues. So I think we really have accomplished a set of tools in which one can think about policy making of gardens in the future. So Robin and Marcel, thank you so much for joining us from abroad. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to end this with a discussion between all of us, but I hope we join you in the future and really think about hands-on projects in the Geddes year. So thank you, Marcel and Robin, again.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and the presentations will be available online and will be shown in the Liebling website. So thank you so much again, Robin and Marcel, and for all the other speakers as well, of course, that are here.
אני יואל סיגל, אני חלק מהצוות היגוי של ה-Urban Thinkers Campus, עובד הרבה עם מייק טרנר בבצלאל, בנושא של מחקרים באופן כללי. אז, ואני גם כן אחד היועצים של UN Habitat, אז אני קצת מחבר בין הפרויקט הזה ספציפית, היוזמה הזאת, וגם UN Habitat ובכלל, בכל הנושא. I'll switch to English because I just, for the record, formally, in case it's going to be probably used internationally. So on a personal note, I love the introduction that you made, putting the circle with the portrait of Geddes in the middle, because when you uncovered the portrait, it was a sociologist. Well, that's me. I mean, I'm not an urban planner. So for me, all of a sudden getting legitimation in this context was very important. However, I think that clearly what comes out is the importance of people in the center. This is people-centered planning, people-centered development. And when we were going around, when we see from our person who led our group in the park, but one of the comments that was made was that it's an intimate, it's a sensual experience. Going out to the park, we went through we had to, touch things, smell things, look at things, and breathe in things, and that sense of community and belonging is part of an intimate interaction between people and between our environment. And it's that the ability to have this intimate interaction is one of the things that I think we have to take from today's discussion. That's one of the first points. The second one is green. Okay, everybody talks about green. That's very, very clear. But green is usually considered not just what Geddes is saying, and not what just in my neighborhood from UN Habitat, but it's the add-on. Green is the add-on. It's the nice to have. We've done the streets, we've done the sewage, we've done the housing, we've done the economic, and what's ever left over we can use for green. Well, I think what we have to do is change it. Green has to be considered one of the critical infrastructures. I'm involved in a project with the European Union, and they've identified critical infrastructure. And when I suggested looking at the Merchavat Tziburi, open space and green space, as a critical infrastructure, they looked and said, that's really not part of our job. They talked about energy, they talked about transportation, they talked about water and sewage, but green, that's not infrastructure. So I think what we have to do is begin to say green is not the leftover, but green is a fundamental infrastructure. That's a foundation infrastructure. So that's number two. Number three is language. And I think one of the things that I particularly liked about your comment, Alicia, was literacy, landscape literacy. And because it was also in one of the other presentations, how you name a place, how you read the landscape, that's what gives its meaning. And then meaning is translated into design, and from design into operation, and then from maintenance, and so on and so on, and then the interaction. So all of these things combined, it's multidimensional, so that's the third thing that I want to take away from today. But that means going from, what does that mean in terms of operational? We're still using the language of Lashimur, of protection. Well, in the biosphere movement today, they don't talk about protection, they talk about nourishment. And the interesting thing when you're talking about the Mill Creek, in downtown Seoul, they talked about converting I forget the name of the river, the river. They talked about they're not protecting, but nourishing and enhancing biodiversity. So I think we have to begin to change our language. Green is not the add-on. Green is not just the impact assessment. Green has to be nourished. We have to go, and if I can make this a suggestion given in today's terminology, going from tactics of protection to a strategy of development and nourishment. That's a change in our language. And that change in language, though, positions green in a different place. So that's number two. Number three about that is going from, and that was mentioned earlier, we're no longer in the world of public participation. We're in the world of active community engagement. Now, that's already been reflected in many of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of UN Habitat, but we still use the terminology of public participation. So I think again here we need a change of language. And finally, that relates to the story. Telling the story is about telling the story and retelling the story. As Mike Turner says very clearly, legacy is not about rehashing the past and protecting the past. It's the legacy we're going to present and transfer to our future. So green here is not about how we're going to protect the historical legacy of Geddes, but rather, and has been said many times already today, but I just want to reinforce it, that this is the legacy we want to project future. It's how we're going to take the poor past and make it relevant to today. So what are we committed to? All right. So I think, first of all, we have to committed to, again, saying we see planning and urban development as people-centered. It is both bottom-up, it's also top-down, but it also has to be bottom-up. Secondly, green, as I mentioned, green is an infrastructure, meaning that roads, services, housing, and the like are not just, green is not the leftover, as I mentioned earlier. That's a fundamental, that's what we have to be committed to. Thirdly, sharing knowledge internationally. I think one of the things that grows out of this, and Mike had suggested it earlier today, we think about Garden City Network. Garden City Network, not just within Israel, but internationally. I think when we do things internationally, we have a different level of legitimation. And that will bring me to my final point. The steering committee has begun to put together what we're going to call the Tel Aviv Declaration. Now that may sound a bit bombastic, but since I've been in a number of different sessions similar to this in UN Habitat, the Barcelona statement, for example, which was done, I guess 12 years ago, was out of an expert group meeting of people, and that then became the foundation for part of SDG 11, Sustainable Goal 11. So out of sessions like this, when a formal declaration is made and it gets adapted and put in the context of UN Habitat and UNESCO in the historic urban landscape, it has value, it has weight. It becomes a guiding principle which goes beyond our specific event that we're holding here and next 2 weeks in Jerusalem. We've done a preliminary draft of that. It's going to be circulated amongst people. We're going to begin to get input, and after we have the discussion today, we'll have additional input, and then on the 13th of November, additional input, and then we'll do a final version to that to get it circulated, and then get it approved by UN Habitat, put into their international framework as part of the Urban Thinkers Campus. So we have a framework in which to do it. It's not just to say, okay, we're going to write a document and forget about it. No, we have a context, and we have the connection to do that. And lastly, the last point I want to make has to do with the last thing that you said today again, Lisa, was continuity. I have gray hair already, so it means that I've been doing this for a long time. It's actually more than 50 years. And one of the most important things I can say is it requires continuity. Projects, if you stick to the level of projects, which are 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they frequently get lost. It is a commitment. It's a commitment for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. Then you need the continuity, and we have to have that commitment to our continuity. I have a few of my colleagues here who have been doing this with me for this period of time, so we can say, yes, sometimes the magic works. Thank you very much. That's what we'll take away from the day.
Thank you so much. It was a really good final point. So I will continue with Hebrew because I just want to tell you that we will make a break. נעשה הפסקה. ובעצם אנחנו נעשה הפסקה ונשתה קפה למעלה. יש שם מרפסת מאוד נחמדה ויש שם עוגיות וקפה. ואז אנחנו בעצם, למי שישרוד, ואני יודעת שזה קשה, אז תרגישו בנוח, מי שלא מסוגל, אנחנו לא נכעס. אני גם תכף אגיד כמה מילים על ההמשך, שבכל זאת יקרה, כי באמת יהיה פה